The airport was buzzing with its usual chaos. Passengers hurrying to catch their flights, announcements echoing over the intercom, and the scent of coffee and fast food lingering in the air. Among the crowd was 12-year-old Malik, clutching a worn backpack and a ticket in hand. His eyes sparkled with excitement, a stark contrast to the apprehension visible on his grandmother's face as she walked beside him. This was Malik's first flight, a milestone in his young life, and his grandmother had saved for months to give him this experience. Little did they know, this journey would change their lives forever. As they approached the gate, Malik couldn't contain his enthusiasm. "Grandma, do you think I'll get a window seat?" he asked, his voice filled with the unfiltered curiosity and joy of a child. His grandmother smiled warmly, her weathered hands resting on his shoulder. "We'll see, Malik. Just remember to mind your manners and follow the rules, okay?" she replied, her tone gentle yet firm. Malik nodded eagerly, unaware of the storm brewing ahead. The flight was slightly delayed, and tensions among the passengers were palpable. The airline staff moved briskly, trying to manage the situation. Among them was a flight attendant named Karen, a woman who exuded authority but lacked the warmth that could put passengers at ease. Her sharp gaze swept over the crowd, her polished uniform impeccable as she coordinated boarding. When it was finally time to board, Malik and his grandmother handed over their tickets. Karen barely glanced at them as she waved them through. They found their seats, two cramped spots near the middle of the plane. Malik had been lucky enough to get his coveted window seat, and his face lit up as he gazed out at the runway. But just as the plane was about to finish boarding, Karen reappeared, her expression stern and unyielding. She stopped abruptly at Malik's row and glanced at the pair with a raised eyebrow. "Excuse me," she said, her tone laced with irritation. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Malik's grandmother looked confused. "Yes, these are the seats on our tickets," she replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her heart. Karen pursed her lips and checked her clipboard. "I need to see those tickets again," she demanded. Fumbling slightly, Malik's grandmother pulled out the tickets and handed them over. Karen scrutinized them for an uncomfortably long time before snapping. There seemed to be a mistake. "You'll have to leave the plane." The passengers around them exchanged glances, murmuring amongst themselves. Malik's face fell, and his grandmother's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "A mistake? We did everything right. How can there be a mistake?" she asked, her voice trembling. Karen crossed her arms, her gaze icy. "I didn't have time to explain. Please collect your belongings and step off the plane." The finality in her tone left no room for argument. Malik's grandmother looked around helplessly, hoping for someone to intervene, but the other passengers avoided her gaze. As they were escorted off the plane, Malik's grandmother tried to keep her composure, whispering soothing words to her grandson. But Malik's heart ached, not just from the humiliation, but from the lingering question. Why did this happen to them? 5 minutes later, something extraordinary occurred. A man in a crisp suit strode into the gate area, his expression a mix of authority and urgency. He locked eyes with Malik and his grandmother, then turned to the airline staff. The murmurs of confusion among the remaining passengers grew louder as the man's voice rose, commanding attention. What happened next would shake the airline to its core and turn Malik's heartbreak into an opportunity that no one could have foreseen. The man in the crisp suit walked with an air of purpose, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the airport floor. His name was Mr. Jameson, and though no one knew it at that moment, he was someone who carried a great deal of influence. His presence alone seemed to command the attention of everyone nearby. As he approached Malik and his grandmother, who were seated on a small bench near the gate, he noticed the sadness etched into their faces. He paused, his expression softening as he crouched down to meet Malik's gaze. "Hello there," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "I saw what just happened. Are you okay?" Malik hesitated, unsure of how to respond. His grandmother, ever protective, spoke up instead. "We're fine," she said, though her voice betrayed the hurt she felt inside. "It's just a misunderstanding, I'm sure." Jameson tilted his head slightly, studying them. Misunderstanding or not, no one should be treated like that. Can you tell me what happened? He asked, his tone inviting but firm, as though he wouldn't accept a simple dismissal. With a deep breath, Malik's grandmother recounted the events. How they had been asked to leave despite holding valid tickets, the dismissive way they had been treated, and the humiliation of being forced to disembark in front of so many people. As she spoke, Jameson's jaw tightened, and a flicker of something, anger, perhaps, passed across his otherwise composed face. When she finished, Jameson stood up and adjusted his tie. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said. "You shouldn't have had to go through this. Let me see what I can do." Before they could respond, Jameson turned and walked briskly toward the gate counter. The airline staff behind the desks straightened up immediately, sensing his authority. Karen, the flight attendant, had just returned from the plane, and her face paled slightly when she saw him. "Mr. Jameson," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "I didn't realize you were here today." Jameson didn't bother with pleasantries. "Karen, I'd like an explanation for what just happened. Why were those passengers removed from the flight?" His tone was calm, but carried a weight that made it clear he expected a thorough answer. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her colleagues as if hoping for backup. "There was an issue with their tickets," she stammered. "I was just following protocol." Jameson raised an eyebrow. "Protocol? Are you sure about that? Because from where I stood, it looked more like a decision made without proper justification." Karen's face flushed. "I thought there was a double booking. It happens sometimes." Jameson held her gaze for a moment before turning to the other staff. "Can someone pull up the booking records, please? Let's confirm whether there was truly an error." The room grew tense as one of the staff members hurriedly typed into the computer. Moments later, they looked up, their expression nervous. "Mr. Jameson, there's no record of a double booking. The tickets were valid." Jameson's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked back at Karen, whose face had gone pale. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Karen, would you care to explain why you removed those passengers if their tickets were perfectly fine?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She glanced around, desperate for a way out, but found none. Jameson let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "I'll deal with this matter later," he said, his tone final. "Right now, I want those passengers rebooked on the next available flight. And I'll be accompanying them personally to ensure there are no further misunderstandings." The staff nodded quickly, springing into action. Jameson turned back toward Malik and his grandmother, who had been watching the scene unfold from their bench. As he approached, Malik's grandmother stood, clutching her grandson's hand tightly. "They're going to put you on the next flight," Jameson said, his voice kind but steady. "And I'll make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." Malik's grandmother hesitated. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly. Jameson smiled faintly, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because no one should feel powerless in a situation like this." As they waited for the next flight, Jameson stayed by their side, chatting with Malik about his excitement for flying and gently reassuring his grandmother that everything would be okay. He learned that Malik was a bright, curious boy with big dreams, and that his grandmother had worked tirelessly to support him after the loss of his parents. The more Jameson listened, the more he felt a deep sense of admiration for their resilience. But Jameson also knew there was more to address than just this one incident. He couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened was part of a larger issue, one that needed to be confronted. As the boarding announcement for the new flight echoed through the terminal, Jameson made a silent promise to himself. He would make sure this wasn't just a one-time fix. This was personal now. As they boarded the plane together, Malik looked up at Jameson with wide eyes. "Thank you for helping us," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Jameson placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're welcome, Malik. But remember, you deserve to be treated with kindness and respect always." What none of them knew yet was that this moment would mark the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would not only bring justice, but also create an unexpected and powerful connection between Malik and Jameson. And while Malik couldn't possibly have predicted it, his life was about to take a turn so extraordinary that it would leave everyone, himself included, utterly astonished. As the plane took off, Malik sat by the window, his wide eyes glued to the world below. The city shrank rapidly, the cars and buildings turning into specks against the vast landscape. For a moment, his excitement returned, overshadowing the earlier humiliation. He turned to his grandmother, who managed a weak smile, though her mind still replayed the events from earlier. Jameson sat across the aisle, his laptop open, but untouched as he kept a watchful eye on the two. Something about the way Karen had acted didn't sit right with him, and he couldn't let it go. Malik's grandmother tried to engage her grandson in light conversation, asking him about what he looked forward to most on their trip. But her voice was tinged with exhaustion, and she occasionally glanced toward Jameson, silently wondering what kind of man he was. His intervention had been unexpected, almost too good to be true. Yet, there he was, ensuring they were taken care of, even when he didn't have to. Midway through the flight, Jameson leaned over to speak to her. "Man," he began, keeping his tone low, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but has anything like this happened to you before?" She hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but something about his sincerity made her feel safe. "Not quite like this," she admitted, "but we've had our share of struggles. People don't always see Malik for the bright, kind boy he is. They just see—" Her voice trailed off, but Jameson understood what she meant. "That's what I thought," he said softly, nodding. "What happened back there wasn't just an error. It was wrong on every level, and I'm going to make sure it's addressed." Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, word of the incident had started to spread. Karen's behavior had drawn attention, not just because of her treatment of Malik and his grandmother, but because of Jameson's involvement. Unbeknownst to most, Jameson wasn't just an ordinary passenger. He was a senior executive with the airline, a fact Karen clearly hadn't realized in her haste to act on her own biases. Emails began flying back and forth between departments as staff scrambled to gather details. The flight logs, Karen's records, and even footage from the boarding gate were pulled for review. Among the higher-ups, there was a growing sense of unease. Jameson had a reputation for being fair but unyielding when it came to issues of integrity, and this situation was shaping up to be a test of the airline's values. Back on the plane, Malik, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, turned to Jameson with a question. "Do you fly a lot?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. Jameson smiled. "I do. It's part of my job." "What do you do?" Malik pressed, tilting his head. Jameson paused for a moment, considering how to answer. "I help run the company that owns this airline," he said finally. Malik's eyes widened. "You own the planes?" Jameson chuckled softly. "Not exactly, but I help make decisions about how things are done. That's why what happened to you and your grandmother is something I take very seriously." Malik's grandmother looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're an executive?" she asked, her voice laced with a mix of surprise and skepticism. Jameson nodded. "Yes, Mum. But today, I'm just here as someone who believes in doing what's right." Her expression softened, though she still seemed guarded. "Well, we appreciate what you've done for us. But I hope this isn't just about smoothing things over." "It's not," Jameson assured her. "I'm not interested in covering things up. I want to fix what's broken, and that starts with understanding why this happened." As the plane began its descent, Jameson's resolve deepened. He knew this was more than just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that he couldn't ignore. He decided then and there to launch a full investigation, not just into Karen's behavior, but into the company's culture as a whole. If this was happening under his leadership, it was his responsibility to address it. When the plane landed, Jameson escorted Malik and his grandmother to the baggage claim, ensuring they had everything they needed before saying goodbye. He handed them his business card, promising to stay in touch. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call," he said. "And Malik, keep dreaming big. The sky's the limit for you." As they walked away, Malik turned to his grandmother. "Do you think we'll see him again?" he asked. She sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know, Malik. But something tells me this isn't the end of the story." It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Jameson delved deep into the company's operations, uncovering practices and attitudes that had gone unchecked for far too long. Meanwhile, Malik and his grandmother tried to move past the incident, but the memory lingered, a reminder of how far they still had to go in a world that often judged them unfairly. What none of them realized was that their lives were on a collision course with something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. And as the pieces began to fall into place, it became clear that this wasn't just about fixing one flight, or even one airline. This was about challenging the status quo and redefining what it meant to truly soar. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that fateful flight lingered in Malik's mind like a stubborn shadow. He went back to his usual routine: school, homework, and helping his grandmother with chores. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening behind the scenes. Every now and then, he'd glance at the small business card Jameson had given him, tucked neatly into his favorite book. He hadn't called, but knowing it was there felt like a lifeline. Unbeknownst to Malik, Jameson was working tirelessly. What had started as a single incident to address had unraveled into a much bigger issue. His investigation revealed a troubling pattern: complaints of bias, poor training, and a culture that allowed subtle forms of discrimination to go unchecked. Employees like Karen weren't the root of the problem. They were symptoms of a system that needed a complete overhaul. The deeper Jameson dug, the angrier he became. How had this been allowed to happen on his watch? Meanwhile, Karen was suspended pending a formal review. The airline's management team was divided. Some argued that firing her would set a strong example, while others worried about bad press. Jameson, however, wasn't interested in quick fixes. "This isn't about Karen," he told his team during a tense meeting. "It's about making sure no one else ever feels the way that Boy and his grandmother did. If we don't address the bigger issue, this will keep happening." While Jameson fought battles in boardrooms, Malik's grandmother faced her own struggles. News of the incident had quietly spread within their community, sparking conversations about fairness and justice. Some neighbors praised her for standing her ground, while others whispered that she should have let it go. Why stir the pot? One woman asked, "What good does it do?" But Malik's grandmother didn't see it that way. She hadn't chosen to make a stand. It had been forced upon her. And now she felt a growing responsibility to speak out. One evening, as they sat together in their modest living room, Malik noticed his grandmother staring out the window, lost in thought. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She turned to him, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm fine, Malik," she said. "I'm just thinking about how we got here. You deserve better than what happened to us. And I'm starting to think it's up to us to make sure things change." Malik frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What can we do?" he asked. "We're just us." His grandmother smiled faintly, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "Sometimes it's the smallest voices that make the biggest difference," she said. "We just have to be brave enough to use ours." At the same time, Jameson was preparing for what he knew would be the most important presentation of his career. He had compiled weeks of evidence into a detailed report, outlining not only the problems, but also a bold plan to fix them. It wasn't going to be easy. His recommendations included sweeping changes to hiring practices, mandatory bias training for all employees, and a complete overhaul of the company's customer service protocols. It was an ambitious plan, and he knew it would face resistance. As the day of the presentation approached, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had the data, the solutions, and the support of a few key allies within the company. But he needed something more, something that would make the boardroom truly understand the human impact of their decisions. That's when it hit him. He needed Malik and his grandmother. With some hesitation, Jameson picked up the phone and dialed the number on the phone he had kept from their flight. When Malik's grandmother answered, her voice was cautious but polite. "This is Clara," she said. "Miss Clara, it's Jameson," he said, his tone respectful. "I hope I'm not bothering you." There was a pause, and then her voice softened. Not at all. What can I do for you, Mr. Jameson? I've been working on something, he explained, something that could make a real difference. But I think it would be much more powerful if you and Malik were part of it. Would you be willing to join me at a meeting with the airline's leadership team? Clara hesitated, glancing at Malik, who was busy with a school project at the dining table. What exactly are you asking us to do? She asked. I want them to hear your story, Jameson said. Not just as numbers on a chart or as a case study, but as real people. I think that's the only way they'll truly understand why change is necessary. Clara exhaled deeply, weighing the decision. She didn't relish the idea of revisiting that painful day, but she also knew this was an opportunity to make a difference. Not just for Malik, but for others like him. All right, she said finally. We'll do it. The day of the meeting arrived, and Clara and Malik entered the towering glass building where Jameson's office was located. Malik's eyes widened as he took in the sleek decor and bustling atmosphere. Jameson met them in the lobby, greeting them warmly before escorting them to the conference room. Inside, a dozen executives sat around a long table, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Jameson introduced Clara and Malik and stepped aside to let them speak. Clara's voice was steady as she recounted their experience, but there was a quiet strength in her words that silenced the room. Malik, nervous at first, found his courage as he described how excited he'd been for his first flight, and how that excitement had turned to confusion and hurt. When they finished, the room was heavy with silence. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked genuinely moved. Jameson stood, breaking the tension. This, he said firmly, gesturing to Clara and Malik, is why we need to do better. Not just for them, but for every passenger who trusts us to treat them with dignity. As the meeting continued, the tension in the room grew. Not everyone was on board with Jameson's plan, and the debate became heated. Clara and Malik watched from the sidelines, their presence a quiet reminder of what was at stake. Jameson remained calm but resolute, countering every objection with facts, logic, and an unwavering belief in doing what was right. The meeting stretched late into the evening, the outcome uncertain, but one thing was clear: the fight for justice was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The meeting finally adjourned, and Clara and Malik stepped out into the cool evening air. Jameson walked them to the curb, his expression hard to read. Clara glanced at him, sensing his frustration. Do you think they'll listen? She asked quietly. Jameson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Some will, he said. Others that need more convincing. But don't worry, I'm not giving up. Malik tugged on his grandmother's sleeve. You did really good, Grandma, he said, his voice filled with admiration. Clara smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride. Thank you, sweetheart, she said softly. We'll see where it goes. As they drove home, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Her mind replayed the faces of the executives, some nodding in agreement, others frowning with resistance. There had been one man in particular, a senior board member named Mr. Bennett, who had seemed especially skeptical. His dismissive tone during the meeting had grated on her nerves. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Back at the airline, Jameson returned to his office, exhausted but determined. The presentation had gone as well as he could have hoped, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. He sat at his desk, scrolling through emails, when an anonymous message popped into his inbox. The subject line read, ****, flight incident, you're missing something. ***. Curious and wary, Jameson opened the email. It contained only a single sentence. Look into Bennett's connections. He's not as neutral as he claims. Attached was a file labeled confidential. Jameson hesitated, his instincts on high alert. He opened the attachment and found a series of documents that, at first glance, didn't make much sense. But as he read further, his stomach sank. The documents outlined a disturbing pattern of behavior. Mr. Bennett, The very board member who had opposed the proposed reforms most vocally had a history of working behind the scenes to protect certain employees, including Karen. Emails showed him dismissing complaints, downplaying incidents, and in some cases, actively blocking disciplinary action. It wasn't just negligence. It was a calculated effort to maintain the status quo. Jameson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had realized. Bennett wasn't just resisting change. He was actively perpetuating the very culture that had allowed what happened to Malik and Clara to occur. And now, it seems, someone within the company had decided to blow the whistle. The next morning, Jameson called an emergency meeting with a few trusted allies. He shared the information he received, carefully avoiding any mention of the anonymous source. "This changes everything," he said grimly. "If Bennett is interfering at this level, it's not just a moral issue, it's a legal one. We need to act quickly." One of his colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman named Elise, frowned as she reviewed the documents. "If this gets out, it'll be a PR nightmare," she said. "But it could also be the leverage we need. If Bennett's protecting employees like Karen, it proves this isn't an isolated issue." Jameson nodded. "Exactly. But we need to be strategic. If we confront Bennett directly, he'll deny everything and try to cover his tracks. We need to build an airtight case before we take this to the board." As they worked to gather more evidence, tensions within the company began to escalate. Word of the investigation leaked, and the atmosphere grew charged with rumors and suspicion. Employees whispered about Bennett's influence and speculated about who had sent the anonymous tip. Karen, still suspended, became increasingly vocal about her situation, accusing the company of scapegoating her to distract from larger problems. Meanwhile, Clara received an unexpected phone call. A reporter from a major news outlet had somehow caught wind of the incident and wanted to interview her and Malik. "We think your story could shine a light on the broader issues within the airline industry," the reporter said. "Would you be willing to share your experience?" Clara hesitated, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to speak out, to ensure the truth was heard. But she also worried about exposing Malik to more attention. "Let me think about it," she said finally, promising to call the reporter back. That evening, she called Jameson to tell him about the request. "Do you think it's a good idea?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Jameson was quiet for a moment, considering. "It's a powerful platform," he said carefully, "but it also comes with risks. If you decide to go public, you'll need to be prepared for pushback. People will question your motives, try to discredit you. It won't be easy." Clara sighed, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I just want to do what's right," she said finally. "And you will," Jameson assured her. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." The next day, Jameson received another email from the anonymous source, this time with a single line. "Asterisk, you're running out of time. Bennett knows you're on to him." Asterisk. Jameson's heart pounded as he read the message. If Bennett was aware of their investigation, it meant he would be taking steps to protect himself, and possibly to retaliate. The stakes had just been raised, and Jameson knew they were racing against the clock. At the same time, Malik overheard his grandmother talking on the phone about the reporter's request. "Are we going to tell the story on TV?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Clara hesitated, then knelt down to meet his gaze. "Maybe," she said, "but only if you're okay with it. This is our story, Malik. If we share it, it might help other people, but it's also okay to keep it private." Malik thought for a long moment, then nodded. "I think we should tell it," he said firmly, "so people know what really happened." As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that the next few days would be critical. Jameson, Clara, and Malik were on a collision course with the truth, and what they uncovered would change everything. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger, and none of them could predict just how high the stakes would go. The day of reckoning arrived faster than anyone expected. Jameson had scheduled a second board meeting to present the findings of his investigation, this time armed with irrefutable evidence of systemic issues, and most importantly, Mr. Bennett's interference. Clara and Malik were once again invited to share their story, but Jameson had yet to reveal the full scope of what he had uncovered to them. He wanted their voices to be the moral compass that guided the conversation, untainted by the corporate politics swirling around them. As Clara and Malik walked into the conference room, the tension in the air was palpable. Executives murmured in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward Mr. Bennet, who sat stone-faced at the head of the table. Jameson greeted Clara and Malik warmly, but his usual calm demeanor carried an undercurrent of urgency. Something was different this time. The meeting began with Jameson outlining the progress made since their last gathering. He spoke about the steps being taken to improve training, foster inclusivity, and rebuild trust with customers. But then his tone shifted, becoming sharper, more deliberate. However, he said, looking directly at Mr. Bennet, we've also uncovered troubling actions within our own leadership. A murmur swept through the room as Jameson began presenting the evidence. Email threads, internal memos, and witness testimonies painted a damning picture of Bennet's actions. Clara watched as the man's expression tightened, his jaw clenched in defiance. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Bennet tried to defend himself, his voice loud and authoritative. "This is a smear campaign," he declared, glaring at Jameson. "You're trying to pin the company's problems on me to save face." But Jameson was ready. He calmly clicked to the final slide of his presentation, revealing a signed document, a non-disclosure agreement between Bennet and Karen, dated months before the incident with Malik and Clara. "This proves otherwise," Jameson said, his voice steady. "You didn't just ignore the complaints, you actively suppressed them." The room fell silent. Even Bennet, for all his bluster, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Clara looked at Malik, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, absorbing every moment. She reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. And then, just as it seemed the situation couldn't get any more tense, there was a knock at the door. A woman stepped inside, her presence commanding attention. Clara recognized her immediately. It was the reporter who had contacted her. Jameson seemed equally surprised, but quickly recovered, motioning for her to enter. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the reporter said, her tone crisp. "But I thought you'd want to see this." She handed Jameson a folder, her expression unreadable. Jameson opened it and scanned the contents, his eyes widening. "These are internal financial records," he said, looking up at the reporter. "Where did you get these?" The reporter smiled faintly. "An anonymous source," she said. "It seems Mr. Bennet's misconduct goes beyond policy violations. There are significant financial discrepancies tied to his department." Jameson turned to Bennet, his expression one of incredulous disgust. "You weren't just covering up complaints," he said. "You were profiting from them." The room erupted into chaos. Executives demanded explanations, while Bennet, his face flushed with anger, stood and tried to leave. But before he could reach the door, security entered, summoned by Jameson as a precaution. Bennet was escorted out, his protests echoing down the hall. As the dust settled, Jameson turned to Clara and Malik. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I hope you see now that your courage helped expose something much bigger than any of us expected." Clara nodded, her emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. "I'm just glad the truth came out," she said. Malik, his voice small but determined, added, "Does this mean it's over?" Jameson crouched down to meet Malik's gaze. "It means we're starting fresh," he said. "Thanks to you and your grandmother, we're going to make things better for everyone." In the days that followed, the airline announced sweeping changes, including the immediate dismissal of Bennet and several other implicated employees. Clara and Malik's story became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to speak out against injustices they had experienced. The airline publicly apologized, not just to them, but to all customers who had been affected by similar incidents. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Weeks later, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from Jameson, thanking her for her bravery and informing her of a decision made by the board. As a gesture of goodwill, and as part of the airline's commitment to making amends, they had decided to name Malik the honorary owner of a new scholarship fund for young travelers. The fund, designed to promote diversity and inclusion, would help children like Malik see the world without barriers. Clara read the letter aloud to Malik, who listened in stunned silence. When she finished, he grinned from ear to ear. "Does this mean we did it, Grandma?" he asked. Clara smiled, pulling him into a hug. "We didn't just do it, Malik," she said. "We changed things for the better." And with that, their journey, which had started with pain and injustice, became a story of triumph and hope, proving that even the smallest voices can create ripples that change the world.